All right, go ahead, Christian.
Okay, yeah. Thanks everybody. So welcome to another one of our, AI enablement sessions. This particular session, we're focused on understanding spec-driven development, and this is kind of the topic du jour for a lot of how WEX should work. And today we're focused on Augment as a tool, and we've asked the Augment team to come and present. When I use Augment as a tool, how do I do spec-driven development? And so I just want to cover a couple quick foundational things. We know that not everybody in the organization is using Augment. Not everybody's using the other tools. And so these enablement sessions are kind of meant as a reference for those that are using the specific tools for the sessions that we're doing. And they're also meant for future reference of if you ever start becoming a consumer of one of these additional tools, of kind of like how they work in contrast to. And hopefully what we're able to do is take away some derivatives around, hey, I get some ideas. So let's just say, for example, you're not an Augment user today. I get some ideas on how I can enable my AI workflows to be better by leveraging the patterns, practices, and techniques that these particular tools enable. So just kind of keep that in mind. So questions that are very, very well, for sure. Use the Q&A. I would just try and keep your questions around comparison and contrasting of different AI tools in the organization to a minimum during these enablement sessions. And if you have those questions, please reach out in the one of our AI SDLC channels in GChat, and we can have a broader conversation about that. But for now, I'd like to welcome Augment and hand it over to them. They've graciously agreed to come and host sort of a agentic spec-driven development session with WEX. So with that, Augment, please take it over. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Christian. Hey, WEX team, good to see you all. I'm your account manager, Bo Nielsen. I'm joined by two solution architects today that'll be taking through the bulk of the discussion. We have Sharath and Raf. I can't see if Raf has joined on my screen. Be able to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharath, and I work as a solutions architect here at Augment. So think of me as a technical counterpart for Bo. My expertise is more towards automation, as well as some of the latest trends that we're seeing, especially on how to utilize spec-driven development, especially with multi-agent orchestrations. So that's kind of where I come in. And I'll be joined today with my colleague, Rafael, who should be, yeah, there he is.
Raf, you want to quickly introduce yourself?
I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hi, everyone. Rafael Soares here, one of the solution architects at Augment Code. I joined the company about 4 months ago, coming from Red Hat, where I spent about 12 years there to be here facilitating this enablement/workshop with you guys today.
Great. So Christian and Vish invited us in to primarily talk our take on spec-driven development, how we go about that here at Augment internally, as well as how we partner with our customers. I understand you've had one of these enablements before with another vendor in the space. So Chris, you want to be additive here. Can you help just set the stage on, or Vish, on where you'd like us to get started and how much you would want us to take on there?
Yeah, so the time to use the time wisely, I think it'd be really great if we can go through the implementation of Augment as a developer's lifecycle and how do I use it, evolving from prompt engineering to spec-driven engineering. So it's kind of like, how do I transition from, vibe coding to planned coding, right? Through agent mode, through prompt enhancement, through and then if we have time, we can delve into some deeper topics around agent to agent. But again, I'd rather live a little bit higher in the stack around how do I individually sort of start using specifications to drive outcomes.
Makes sense.
That's good. Vish, you in agreement? Anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely. I think the role of Vexors is shifting from how fast we can produce code to how do we make sure the code is compliant and secure, right? And any of the ways that Augment enables creating the specifications, guiding the agentic behavior, and traceability as we go from an idea to a deployable product will be super helpful.
Sounds good.
Great. Over to you, Raf. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me check if I did this before with Google Meet. I may need to
Here,
get out.
let me try to share mine.
Okay. I think I can go from here.
Okay.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect.
Perfect. That's great. All right. Yeah. So before I show how we can leverage this concept of context, not context, spec-driven development with Augment and Augment tools, I would like to step back a little bit and reflect on the concept, which is it's not new, especially if you are in the software industry for a bit longer. So the agenda that I have for my part today on this session is like, I'm going to go with the introduction of spec-driven development. Then we're going to go to see how Augment Code can help with our context engine. Then we're going to go and see some approaches of AI-assisted development just to compare between vibe coding, using or not using spec-driven development. Then we're going to see how we as Augment see the SDLC using our approach, right? And then we're going to have a small demo of spec-driven development using SpecKit, which is a framework, very known framework of applying this concept in the AI for code, using Augie, which is our agent CLI interface. And then we're going to see another demo using spec-driven development using another tool that we offer for agentic development, which is Intent. Does that sound good? Is that okay for everyone? Awesome. Let's go from there. So as I mentioned, this idea of spec-driven development, it's actually trending right now in this era of agentic software development, but it's definitely something new, right? You may have heard of this idea of using requirements, defining specification, using different terms, right? You may have seen things like requirements, documents, right? Business requirement, document, or BRD, software requirement specification, right? So is spec-driven development drawn from these concepts, like comes from these concepts. Other approaches that you have or methods that you may have seen in the past, if you are old enough in the software industry like me, you may have heard about this rational unified process. This is actually about 20 years ago when I started my career in software development. We used to use this framework that was introduced by IBM. I can see some emojis popping up here now, which is an iterative framework, right? So you do risk management, component-based architecture, visual modeling. Was pretty heavy, but the idea was to kind of define all the requirements needed to before you start writing code, right? You may have heard about test-driven development, TDD, where you start writing tests, then you go to functional code and start iterating with changing the code until your tests or unit tests pass, all green, right? So you go from red to green, and then you're good to move on to the next functionality. Also, another very known concept in the agile movement, which is behavior-driven development, or BDD, which promotes collaboration between developers, Q&A engineers, non-technical stakeholders, the people that know the business, right? So they communicate using a kind of a unified language to come up with all the guardrails and all the requirements needed to implement that piece of software, right? It uses a formula which is given, when, and then basically you write stories instead of a big specification, right? So let's say, given the user wants to log into the system, the user needs to provide their credentials, and the system has to validate their credentials, and if it is good, the user can log in. If not, the system presents a message to the user. This kind of stories. So spec-driven development brings draws from these concepts, from these methodologies that we see in the past. And how we can define spec-driven development. I like this definition from a blog post that I saw recently on the ThoughtWorks website that was written by a engineer called Brigitte Bakker. And it essentially says, a spec is a structured, behavior-oriented, you see here this behavior-driven, behavior-oriented artifact, right? Or a set of related artifacts written in natural language that express software functionality and serves as a guidance to AI coding agents. I want to highlight this last part here, right? That serves as a guidance to the AI. And we're going to explore more around this, but this guidance to the agent is very important, because without that, without a specification, without a requirement, you essentially rely entirely on the, let's say, the creativity or the non-determinism of the agent, right? Which for some tasks can be good, but for complex tasks is not good at all, right? This same blog post I can share with you later on. It's very interesting. This engineer, she presents different levels of spec-driven development, and that's what caught my attention when I was reading that. Is that she describes this idea of a spec first, right? When you define a specification, refine that specification, pass on to your AI agent, and the AI agent starts writing code. But then nobody comes back to the specification again, right? And then the next level is this AI anchored, which essentially you maintain the specification and keep the specification evolving as you make changes on your piece of software. The other level is the spec as a source. When you come to that level, and I can tell that not all tools has this in place right now. You don't touch the code anymore. The source of truth and absolute source of truth is the specification, is your requirement document. You only interact with this document. We're gonna get there, but right now all the tools are maturing, and we'll get there. But the majority of the tools right now are considered by in this blog post, she considers as all of them are spec first. You write specification, the agent implements it, and then you move on to the next feature. So far, so good. Any comment? Let me pause here before we go.
Yeah, great call outs. This is exactly the reason why we need to have traceability for the spec that influence the agentic behavior and all the artifacts that are generated.
That's a good point, Vish. That's exactly what we're going to explore. Another concept that she brings in this blog post is this idea of memory bank, which is essentially the context that you and the agent use both to write the specification and also to implement code, right? So the specification has the requirements, has the guidance, but the agent also needs good context to implement and to understand what you are trying to achieve, right? So keep in mind this idea of context here that we're gonna explore. And that's where Augment code shines, right? That's one of our biggest differentiators is our context engine, which is a very sophisticated mechanism that is able to index your entire code base, understand your code base, and create a semantic map. This semantic map serves the agent and the models with just the right and enough context for you to implement your feature, to fix your bug. And we're gonna dive a little bit more on this later on, but the context engine is essential and crucial here when writing your specification, right? As your senior or principal engineers, the person that most knows your code base, your agent has to be able to find the right piece of code that's relevant for what you are trying to achieve, for the task that you have at hand. Right? So you can see the context engine as a smarter way to get the right piece of code when you are interacting with your agents, right? You use a very sophisticated mechanism and infrastructure to serve and surface the models and the agents. And as you move on throughout the phases of the software development lifecycle, our context engine is crucial in all these phases. We surfaces not only context for the code generation piece or for the specification piece, but also to review the code, to generate unit tests, to identify root causes of failures in production, to identify failures in your CI and CD pipelines. So the context engine here surfaces your entire SDLC and is very important through all the phases. Right? Let's take a look on the different approaches of AI-assisted development workflows. So the most simplistic, and that's the first experience that someone have when using AI for code tools, is what is known by vibe coding, right? So in vibe coding, you go from an initial prompt, and then you go right for hand over to the agent to start writing code, right? And here is where the danger happens, because without a specification and a very shallow prompt, you rely entirely on the non-deterministic nature of the agents or of the models, right? The models will do their best to guess what you are trying to achieve. So let's say, for instance, I want to implement a authentication flow using Google. Well, there are 10 different ways to implement that. There are different libraries, there are different approaches. And if you don't specify exactly how your authentication flow and how it should integrate with the rest of your ecosystem, the model will guess, and this kind of approach can lead to a more time than if you would spend time writing a specification, because you are going to iterate with a lot of turns to get it right, to get to your desired state. You're going to burn much more tokens. You're going to burn your time. And the worst is that at the end of this process, the end of this workflow, you don't know how to explain how the agent came up with that implementation, because all the knowledge, all the reasoning is buried on that agent session. And when you close that session, nothing was documented. You don't know how to maintain that thing. That's the dangers of the vibe coding approach. In a traditional SDLC, we have all these phases, right? Think about all human-based here. So you go from planning and design, then you start implementing, then you build your application, you perform some Q&A to assure that the implementation is reflecting what you designed first. Then when you get to a certain state, you deploy that application and you maintain it. This is a traditional SDLC. So how spec-driven development fits here on an agentic AI workflow? So basically, this is the flow that you have. So from an initial prompt, where you define what you are trying to achieve, you have an AI-assisted spec specification and plan. So you can use your agent to help you write your specification and your plan. That's what you're going to see in a moment when you show a demo. And if you're happy with that specification, you can pass to the design phase, and then you can move on. If you're not happy, you as a human has the opportunity to keep in the loop and refining that specification, refining that plan until you get to a desired state, when you can hand it over to your agent. Okay, you can move on and implement that. So the agent and your model has no much room to be creative or to come up with something that has nothing to do with your plan, okay? Yes, Michael?
So when you get to the step of, you have the initial prompt, and then if I understand your diagram correctly, you are using AI to help detail your spec and plan, right? So the AI is helping to build that too. And then it goes ahead and implements it.
Yep.
Ultimately. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct. And then when you design your system, if you're happy, you can let the agent implement the thing for you, or you can keep refining your design, right? So you can act in 2 steps here in this diagram. It does not represent every workflow, but this just to give an idea of how you can use spec-driven development approach and AI-assisted specification definition, right? And how we at Augment see and help our customers to transform the SDLC. So this is essentially what we see and how we are helping our customers. So we see that agents, because the models, especially from the end of last year in November, when Anthropic and GPT drop off these powerful models, Opus 4.6 and GPT 5.3, 5.4, we have seen an exponential increase in the capabilities of these agents, right? So we see now that development teams are passing the responsibility more and more to those agents, not only to do code generation, but also to do other things that we traditionally do on our SDLC. Code review, unit test generation, verification, identifying build and test failures, right? And even doing incident response in production. So that's how we see humans and agents collaborating in this new era. Let me pause here and see, Sharaf, do you want to add something on this slide? Feel free to jump in if you want to comment something.
Yeah, I think I see a question and I was typing out the answer, but I did want to quickly talk about that. The question was from Ram. He was asking, in the workflow depicted in the last slide, how do we propose to manage the spec.md? Is it a single file for the whole project, or do we treat it as a living document? And do you have any case studies or recommendations for managing this in a team setting where multiple engineers are modifying the specs simultaneously? So the way I would think about that, Ram, is there are multiple topologies here. You could have a single spec.md file and then treat it as a living document across the life cycle of that entire PR or that entire issue that you're working on. So you could think of that spec.md being a specific living document till the time that particular PR is completed. The other way that I've seen some customers looking at it is taking a single spec.md, but then dissecting it into multiple task.md files or task node MD files. So that's another topology, and that's useful for more complex feature requirements where you may require multiple tasks to be created, and each task could be like a mini spec of its own. The third topology is where you create a high-level spec which talks about the ground rules, more like what you would typically put on Constellation in SpecKit, but a little more kind of granular than that. So create a high-level spec which covers what this entire next 3-month sprints are going to kind of be kind of governed by, and then having like task-specific spec.md. So there are like multiple different kind of topologies that are being followed. SpecKit kind of has its own way of kind of creating like constitution and then specs for each PRs. And then you can have like some other topologies where you can still create like more granular files if needed. So there are like different kind of ways. And the most important thing is how do you kind of do collaboration across these specs? Ideally, you would want to make it a part of, at a minimum, your source control system, or to some extent, I mean, if these are like more specific tactical tasks, then you can also make it a part of your issue management system. But in general, I mean, making it a part of your issue management system at least makes sense if you're looking at like smaller tactical tasks to start with. Anything you would like to add, Rafael, on that? think that makes sense. And Vish, I see, I mean, you talked about, so exactly, I mean, SpecKit kind of covers a lot of these aspects. Like, I think the interesting thing is SpecKit allows you to first kind of create those basic ground rules. Like when I talked about, high level specs, that's what your constitution would be, and then kind of create a more refined way in which you can plan and kind of then apply those specific kind of changes.
All right, thank you, Sharaf. Sorry, I was on mute when you asked it.
No,
you nailed it. Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. Yeah, on the ideation phase, this is where you start writing your specification, right? And that's how we see in the workflows that we are helping customers to implement this. For large features, large functionalities, you start with a human defining the what, the specifications, and then the agent helps you to draft an initial plan or specification. Then you keep iterating with the agent to refine that specification document until you get to a desired point that you can delegate to the agents to start implementation for you. For smaller tasks, you can go from a prompt or from a ticket, or even from a Slack channel, for instance. We have agents that can listen to Slack threads and can create a PR for you, for instance. So you have different approaches here that we can tackle this. Right, so
I think a quick minute to cover one of the questions which I think is relevant to this slide. I think the question from June was, if AI is generating the specs and implementing, then how do we kind of verify the code within our CI/CD verification, and how do we ensure kind of how do we trust the LLM to come out with the right spec and then the right kind of implementation? Because otherwise, we're talking about bad specs leading to bad implementation. So how do you kind of typically do that? I think one of the key things over here, especially with spec-driven development, is you are obviously going to always review and ensure at different parts of this life cycle what is the content being generated. For example, when I look at this slide and human writes a spec, the agent could write a first draft of the spec, but you would definitely want to kind of understand and then kind of refine. And one of the core things over here is like a iteration between a pair programming kind of a iteration between humans as well as an agent. It could be like your product manager and your architect kind of working in tandem with an agent to kind of define and make the spec more and more clearer on what the end goal is. I think that's typically a topology that we've seen working well for really complex specs. For the simplistic specs where we're just talking about a small task, for example, a specific environmental variable either needs to be removed or you need to deduplicate some of the code. In those kind of situations, you most probably would be able to kind of utilize your test harness that you've already created to take care of whether you really need to review at that point of time or let this agent implement it end to end and then kind of verify it. So in that case, I would kind of push it a little to the other sides of the testing phase of SDLC. But usually when we're talking about a complex use case, especially when you're using SpecKit to kind of create your first level spec for a brownfield project, that's where I would kind of put a lot of time into the thought process of whether the spec is actually capturing what all is needed. And this is where also you'll start thinking about, policy governance and things around policy controls. Are these following the guidelines that I've kept for my repo or for my project?
Awesome. Thank you, Sharaf.
And Raf, one question that I'll let you answer is, there was a question about how does this apply to brownfield dev, especially when it comes to both SpecKit and intent. So if you can just cover that, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the complaints that we see in the community right now about all these spec-driven frameworks is it's kind of hard to make them adapt or to infuse them on brownfield projects. This is a known thing, and all these frameworks, SpecKit and others as well, Hassel and OpenSpec, they are trying to address this. But in my demo, I'm gonna show a kind of a brownfield sample. It's an AngularJS application that I will try to migrate from an old version to a new version. But depending on the complexity or the size of your code base, it can be challenging to infuse these frameworks. And that's where Augment Code Context Engine can help as well, because it provides a deep understanding of your code base, and it helps to maintain and write the specification for new features, for modernization, or even for bug fixes as well. And Sharaf will do a demo of Intent, which is it's another spec-driven development focused tool. And Intent has its own approach for spec-driven. And in my experience using Intent so far to implement my projects, I see that it's much easier for brownfield kind of project, because it doesn't impose a very strict directory structure and a set of files that those other frameworks impose. And that's the experience that I'm seeing right now. Yeah.
And Rafael, one more question that we have that maybe I'll take up is, does the context of specification accumulate between user stories? Can it assist with epic breakdowns? How much of a code knowledge base can, in practical terms, be accumulated? So maybe I'll take a first jab at it, and maybe Rafael, I mean, if you feel like there's anything else, let's feel free to add to it.
Yeah.
I think this is exactly where the context engine shines the most. And this is kind of loosely going back to when I was talking about high-level spec to a actual more tactical, specific to a task kind of a spec. So you can effectively take what would be comprising of an epic and then kind of break it down into smaller tasks much better if you had a complete understanding of the code base. And the way Augment kind of takes advantage of that is by ensuring that any research that it does takes into account those context engine calls. So what happens is, let's say, I mean, there's a particular feature functionality I'm working on, and some parts of it are things which have been kind of, or which have been, can be loosely be modeled on pieces which are already existing in your code base. The context engine can very quickly kind of create those tasks and kind of also add reference to places where this similar problem has been solved, so that we can reuse some parts of that. The other thing which could come into play over here is just if you think about just the breaking down of this entire thing into multiple tasks, I mean, that needs a good understanding of what are the different parts of the ecosystem. Have you broken your entire code space into multiple microservices? Is there a separate, how do you kind of separate into front end, back end, and kind of the API layers? All of that context is absolutely essential when you're trying to take an epic and trying to break it down into multiple tasks, because it also then helps you iterate and understand which parts, which particular user stories or which particular parts of the these task lists should be done kind of prior to kind of getting into further into some of the other pieces. So that's, I think, where the context engine actually shines really well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add as well the importance of this context awareness between different modules and parts of the code. Let's say you are introducing a new feature or changing an API contract, for instance. So it's important for the agent to be capable to identify side effects of that new feature, of that contract change. The context engine can definitely help here as well. Okay, so
one pending interesting question that I do want to put it out there. Sorry for cutting a short, Raf. The question is, any guidelines or best practices for good enough spec in spec-driven development? Like, when should we kind of stop iterating, or when should we stop kind of, say, when should we say that, yes, I think the spec is good enough for implementation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, especially if you are using agents to help you write your specification. Some models tend to be more verbose than others. So I think it's important for you as a developer in the loop, review the spec as much as you can, and remove some noise, or yeah, and also, again, if your agent is not capable of understanding your entire code base as a whole, the relationship between modules, all the API contracts, your spec will end up with some parts that does not make sense for what you're trying to achieve, right? So I would say human in the loop and a deep understanding of the code base is key here to keep your specification clean.
The only thing that I'll add to that is it's also, unfortunately, an iterative process. By which what I mean is that when you start your journey, I mean, you'd obviously create a more simplistic kind of a spec template that you want to start out with. And then you would want to slowly kind of, depending on what kind of issue patterns you're seeing with different spec creations, start kind of iterating on the spec template itself or what needs to be kind of created. So just from that perspective, what in terms of best guideline, what I would say is start with something that works well to start with, because you don't want, your first task to be kind of taking too many tokens. You don't want to create the best spec out there just to start with, because remember that you can also, create different agent orchestrations at later stages, for example, at verification stages, to actually catch some of the things that your spec may not be capturing at the first go. So ideally, you would want to start with what you think is a good kind of template to kind of start out with, and then keep a track of where you think some of these misses are, and then kind of keep iterating and adding to that spec template, so that let's say you have one expert or one kind of specialist that you have created for your spec creation, you can keep adding some more nuances to it. So unfortunately, it's going to vary depending on your code base that you're working on or the repo you're working on. But ideally, you should start simpler and then keep on kind of iterating through it, so that you get the a good balance of token consumption. Spec is not too long to start with, and so on. Very wish.
In my experience, it also depends on whether you're building a feature or an MVP, or you're starting a new product or fixing a bug, right? So there is no one standard of or definition of a good, or scoping around a good spec, but it's taking some of the best practices that we already follow from an iterative software development as well.
Absolutely. Perfect.
Yeah. Another thing to keep in mind is that to differentiate is specification, that is, the goal is to drive and steer the agent to implement, and documentation, right? So those models, they are very intelligent, very capable. So you don't need to detail too much in your specification. I would say that you should focus on the constraints, especially the hard constraints of your software, of your piece of functionality, but no need to define too much details, because the agents are very intelligent and knows a bunch of different patterns, different frameworks. So give the guidance and focus on the constraints and let the agent do their work, right? Now, the documentation is another story, right? There it's for humans to read, and then it has to contain more details and more, I would say, can be more verbose, I would say. I was answering Brandon here. He mentioned the caveman, which is a new skill that someone developed in the community that tells the agents to not remove fluffy wording and reduce the usage of token. It's really good. Good call. Right, so let's move on here and let's see how we can use one of these frameworks using Augie CLI, which is one of the interfaces that you can interface with our agents, right? So I'm gonna switch over to my terminal and see how we can leverage spec-driven how we can leverage spec kit using Augie CLI. Is that okay? Any other question before we move on to the demo?
While you're doing that, I'll just go ahead and answer one of the questions that was being asked. So where do the agent skills come into picture in this workflow? Can you have skills at a speccing stage? The answer is yes. There are different ways you can kind of think about utilizing this. For example, I mean, Spec by default, kind of you are usually working with either a sub-agent slash like a slash command kind of a perspective, but that's where you could create a skill which is going to be a spec writer. Some people think of it more from a persona basis, that I'm going to create a persona whose whole and sole job is to do that. So there are like multiple ways for you to kind of create those commonalities or those common ways in which these prompts are going to be kind of utilizing some of the different active. For example, I mean, some of you might still be using MCPs to get connected to, let's say, Jira, but one of the things you could do is create a specific skill where you're actually getting all the relevant pieces from, let's say, a given Jira ticket before the spec writer actually kind of writes it down. So that could all be comprised, or that could all be something that is bundled into a single skill. So where does agent skills come into play? I mean, we will be using agent skills slash persona slash sub-agents kind of in a little intermingled in our conversation, just because, I mean, all of those kind of help you achieve kind of the same goal. And then there's one more question around how does system flag contradictory requirements as they accumulate from user request? How much risk is for last requester taking over the spec? So my assumption with this question is, Andy, just let me keep me honest on this, but you're basically asking about recency risks, that when you're creating these specs, I mean, and you're facing a challenge, I mean, how much of that recency does does it affect us? Is that the question? Or feel free to kind of put yourself out of mute if you want to ask the question.
That is essentially the question. I don't think it fits well with the where we are in the presentation, so I think it can actually defer an answer. Yes, that's why I'm noticing time check, Michael. Essentially, if in a longer software development lifecycle, you encounter situations where users will request something that's contradictory, something a user has requested before. Mm-hmm. And that's something that needs to be flagged and noted and resolved. If that's something that I'm just noting that it's important for it, that needs to be identified, I'm wondering how much of that lives on human responsibility in this space. So it doesn't have to be answered right now, but if it can be answered after the meeting, that would be terrific.
Yeah, sure. We'll try to cover it during the demos. I think that would be the best time. Perfect. And there's only one more question, which is around impact on the employers here. It used to be one dev per project, but with these frameworks, some groups could become redundant. If humans are only needed to review the AI, how does this change the hiring landscape? In all honesty, I mean, any agentic orchestration or workflow that I talk about will always require human judgment. And whenever we are showing any of these demos, we're not talking about design pieces where we're actually thinking about both the front-end design part of it or the policy kind of governance parts of it and so on. So while I agree that it seems like these AI tools or these AI workflows will kind of make it, may actually make some of these roles kind of redundant. But my thought process on this is actually that it helps every role to do a lot more. For example, a designer that I have will be able to work on a lot more kind of projects when we are talking about this and work on more complex projects. So it kind of increases the complexity of projects that you'd be working on, because the agents will be able to take care of the simpler parts, and the actual part of understanding, thinking through the process and creating that workflow kind of comes back to the human. So that's my kind of 2-minute kind of thought process on that. All right, back to you, Ralph.
Thank you. Good questions. That's great. So moving on here. So let's see how we can apply one of these frameworks to help us infuse spec-driven development in our workflow, right? So I believe that many of you here are familiar with SpecKit from GitHub. And SpecKit introduces different phases that you can use throughout your workflow, right? So you have 7 different phases: constitution, specify, clarify, plan, breakdown in tasks. Then you ask the agent to analyze, what you get so far. Then you create a checklist, and finally, you can ask the agent to implement what you are trying to achieve, right? So how we can use it with Augment. I'm gonna show here as my demo a simple AngularJS application, and basically I'm going to migrate AngularJS to Angular 13, which is a more recent version of AngularJS. And we're going to use Spec as a framework and Augie CLI, which is Augment on the CLI, on the terminal. So let me switch over to my terminal over here. So I already went ahead and installed Specify on my terminal. And inside my project, this is an example of brownfield project. I'm not creating from scratch. I got a existing web application. And if you're familiar with SpecKit, it supports different agents, right? So it has support for all the major agents, AI agents out there, including Augie. So the first time you initialize Specify, which is the command to interact with SpecKit, it will ask you which agent are you working with. I choose Augie, as you can see here, and it will initialize, which is essentially will introduce and install a bunch of custom commands that the framework uses. Basically, those 7 commands, 7 phases that we saw on my previous slide. So let me switch my terminal over here. This is Augie. And it's a terminal-driven agent. You can choose your models. There are a bunch of commands here. If you're familiar with other CLI agents like Cloud Code, it's very similar. So let's start. Let's start with the first phase, which is defining the constitution of my project. I'm not going to type everything. I have my demo notes over here. So let's start with the constitution. So because the SpecKit is already installed here in Augie, you can see these commands, SpecKit, and let's go with the constitution that is right over here, right? So let me paste here. And let's go with this. So essentially, the agent will load that custom command and will start creating the constitution of my project. When I get the constitution, I can move on to the specification. So the specification will essentially draft the functional workings of my software, and basically my specification is help me migrate this real-world application to AngularJS 13. And the agent will use and leverage, in case of Augment, it will leverage the context engine to understand how the code, what is the state of the code right now, and help you to write the migration specification for you. Quick question for the audience. Any of you already are familiar with Augie in your workflow? Are you already leverage Augie, or even trying to integrate with SpecKit with Augie? Giuliano hasn't seen yet. So that's a good opportunity for you to try it out, right? So Augment is available in different phases of the SDLC. We started helping developers on the IDE as an extension for VS Code and a plugin for JetBrains. But we are also present on the CLI, where you can start sub-agents, run agents in parallel. You can start different instances of Augie if you are working with different features in parallel. And as you can see now, you can leverage spec-driven development using Augie as well, right? And as the constitution gets written, Augment will start indexing what's being created to keep the context engine up to date. I will not be able, for the sake of time, I'll not be able to go through the 7 phases, but I just want to show how simple it is to install Spec Kit on your project and choose Augie as your agent. You should be able to use all the phases that we saw, and you should be able to go through all of them using / commands on Augie, right? Any question regarding Spec Kit and Augie, or Shraf, if you want to add something here?
No, I think there's one question where the question was around, does Augie support Git work trees? So the answer is yes, it does.
It does.
Yeah, I think that's one. The other thing that I did want to mention over here is that while SpecKit is one of those frameworks which is used very often, but you'll obviously be wanting to kind of do your own kind of changes within some of these different default / commands that get created when SpecKit is installed. What we have seen working really well for most of our customers is where teams take time to kind of customize and kind of try to kind of rework on how SpecKit with Augie will work best with your workflow. And that typically may take some time, because that's where kind of you're going to kind of iterate and eval to some of the changes that you'll be doing on some of these prompts. So that's kind of where you would want to kind of add a little bit of additional time, and that's where someone like Vish would be kind of bringing in some of those things that he has seen working well with the repo and try to kind of help teams standardize that.
Exactly. So this is the result when you install Spec Kit on your project using Augie. You have the traditional .specify, the constitution that got generated by the / command that we just executed, and now the next phase is essentially using our Spec Kit. I think the next phase is specify, right? Specify. Let me just pass the prompt over here. And basically, when I ask draft a functional specification for the migration, I have a huge prompt over here, but essentially it's asking the agent to help me migrate to the latest version of Angular. And you can keep iterating with the agent using all these / commands. Right. Again, for the sake of time.
Question, but before we go there, I'd like to open the forum for Vish, because Vish, I've seen you've already done a little bit of kind of work with SpecKit, and I don't know if you have already used Augie with SpecKit, but what are your thoughts? Are there any gotchas that the team should be learning from you on what, when you went through the process, what were some of the learnings that you had?
Yeah, I mean, at a very high level, one of the reasons why there are multiple initiatives that multiple teams that are evaluating Spec Kits and the framework associated with it. One of the advantages we see is we're able to influence the agentic behavior, providing the sort of a common constitution or guardrails along the way. That way, every developer and every product person or engineer do not have to think about what are the mandatory requirements, what are the mandatory non-functional requirements, what are some of the mandatory skills. Those things we want to simplify so we can have our engineers spend their most valuable time on solving the core problem itself. So that's what I would say. We are also evaluating different ways to inject common rules, common specifications through GitHub SpecKit is one of the frameworks. Yeah. And happy to collect all of your thoughts and some of the challenges so we can incorporate into a common paved road. Ron's team, Christian's team, and Sunny's team, we're all working together towards a set of standard context specifications and guidelines for making this easier for all of Vex.
Makes sense. And then I think Ben has already answered that question around OpenSpec versus SpecKit. So I mean, from our side, we do not typically kind of take a call on what's better, because I think, I mean, most of these frameworks are purpose built for some specific use cases. So it's actually always a good idea that your internal teams do that understanding of what works better for your use case, as well as your process, as well as the tools that you're using. So I think, Ben has already answered that there has been some evaluation which has already been done internally within Bex. So feel free to kind of connect with Ben, Vish, in case you have any other questions. All right, I see one more question, which might be for you, Rafael. Can we run the specific command within VS Code?
Yes.
I need to double check. Last time I saw, I think we were releasing this ability of using slash commands from VS Code. Actually, I can check right now. Yes, you can.
I can share that it works. The specify commands work if you're using GitHub Spec Kit. I have tested it in VS Code, GitHub Copilot, and also Cursor. Definitely, I haven't tested Augment yet. So
yeah,
I just checked on VS Code. It works with Augment.
It works. Yeah, I'm showing right now. Yeah, it's available here. If you don't see, maybe you have to come up here on the settings and enable. If you go to beta, you just enable these slash commands, and you should be able to see here. When you type slash, you can see the commands popping up here. Yep, it's available.
And just because we are on that topic, Rafael, is it possible for you to show when using Augie where these slash commands are created so that the team understands, if they have to, let's say, do any modifications, where exactly are these slash commands to be created or to be kept?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go here, if you open up VS Code, you can see a hidden folder called .augment, and all the commands gets installed under the commands folder. So you can see here the plan command, for instance. You can see the markdown and the front matter. So if you need to make some change or create new commands, just place them under .augment commands MD files. Yeah. And one nice thing here on Augie that I was just, you can stack and create a queue of your commands. So you can see here, all my commands got queued, and as the agent finish one, it will automatically go to the next one. So I have the next one is clarify, plan, tasks, analyze, checklist, and finally implement. All right, so I think next, Sharaf, we can see how intent address this idea of spec-driven development with agent orchestration and whatnot.
I just want to call out just for on the piece where the tasks. The assumption is that not all tasks will be all done in a serial pipeline, right? Like you go through constitution specification, and then you could choose to prioritize some tasks, and then some tasks can be in the following sprint, right? It's not all like in one single shot. You're going from constitution to a deliverable, right? So.
Oh, good call, Vish. Yeah, that makes sense. Great.
Perfect. So let me share my screen, and then we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for the second part, what I wanted to do was, let me share the address for the time being. Just I may have to restart the meeting. No, there we go. Is everyone able to see the screen now?
Yes, we can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Let me minimize this. All right, so for the next part, what I'll do is I'll just talk briefly about one of the latest products that we have recently launched. It's not GA yet. So, I would just say that, at this point of time, this is more of a tool that you can start testing out with, and we see a lot of interest within our customers, but it's again related to spec-driven development. So I thought I would just kind of show you a quick demo. What exactly is it? It's called Intent. So if you go to Google and search Intent by Augment, you should be able to see a download link. It's basically an agentic development experience a product. So instead of an ID where you're focused or your focus primarily is on the code, it's an agentic environment where your focus will be on the agents who are creating that code. So there are slight differences between how you would work with Intent versus how you're typically used to working with VS Code. So first and foremost, what does that involve? So think of Intent as a combination of spec-driven development and agent orchestration kind of built into a single product. Now, this is interesting and this is good because, yeah, sure. I mean, we talked about spec-driven development and Rafael showed how you can do that so easily with SpecKit. But where it starts becoming a little more problematic is how do I now start taking these tasks and implementing it? So Intent tries to kind of provide you with these expert agents that you can start kind of utilizing to take those task nodes, take those specs which have been created, and start kind of creating code out of it. Also create your own verification kind of loops where this entire multi-agent orchestration is kind of being taken care of by Intent. And it uses kind of Augie on the back end, or you can use any other agentic platform that you want to use. So those are the first two parts of it. The third part is isolation and workflow, because now that you're starting to kind of develop and utilize agents within these verification loops, you also do want to make sure that they have dedicated Git trees of their own. They're kind of working in their own isolated environment, and then are able to kind of go back and push all that code back to the main code base or main repository once you have approved and said yes, I mean, all of this looks good. So effectively, a quick way of view about thinking about Intent is it's a UI that you can use on Mac today, which allows you to kind of create your own specs, change how those specs are being created, and then assign agents to implement and verify the code that is being generated. That's kind of how I would think of Intent. Now, there are multiple ways in which you can start using Intent, but primarily I'm talking about the ideation and the planning phase of things, and then a little bit on the implementation side of things. So that's typically where you'd be using Intent, and then you'd be following it up with, let's say, parts of your CI/CD pipeline, taking care of your test harness, taking care of your actual code reviews, and so on. So let's take an example. So the example that I'm going to work on is I'll take Kubernetes as a repository over here, primarily because I want to show a brownfield kind of an example. Plus, if any of you have seen the Kubernetes repositories, it's pretty huge. So any agent will have challenges kind of getting a good understanding of this entire code base because it's just so huge. I wanted to take up this issue, which was already kind of pre-created and is still open. So I wanted to kind of see if Intent can take this up and start kind of doing any of the changes. So what I did was I went ahead and kind of copy pasted this into my linear ticket. I could effectively have kind of used the Kubernetes instance itself, but in this case, I just wanted to show you how it kind of interconnects with other systems. So once you go to Intent, when you have gone ahead and downloaded Intent, right now, as I said, it's available only for Apple Silicon. So if you have a Mac with M4s or M3s, then you will be good to go. For everyone else, you'll have to wait. We're still working on the Linux and Windows builds for it. But once you have that, you can actually go in and start kind of building things. So the first page that you'll come across is this page where it talks about what do you want to build on and which repository you want to kind of use. So in this case, I can go ahead and say, I don't want to use work on Augment, but I want to work on my Kubernetes instance. So in this case, I can look for my Kubernetes repository that I have locally kind of saved over here. And here's where I can decide whether I want to directly work on this master branch that I have as my local repository, or so do I want to work directly on that folder, or do I want to create a Git tree, a work tree for me where I can work on this, and then subsequently once everything is done, kind of push all the code changes back. So in this case, I'll go with the YOLO mode. I'll just say, okay, let's work directly on my local repo. But in your case, it might be a good idea to just kind of, use the Gitry integrations that we already have over here. So repository and branch is kind of selected. Now, next I say which particular linear issue do I want to work on. So this is the issue that I showed you was created. So let's say I want to implement this. So I'll say I want to implement this issue. And I click on create workspace, and intent starts working on it. There are two ways in which I can get it working on intent. I could either use agent orchestration, in which case not only will it go ahead and create a spec for me, but it will actually go ahead and ask me whether after I approve the spec, that should it go and parallelly kind of create the implementers or going to create those implementation changes. And then each implementer will then kind of pass through its verification cycle through a different agent, which will verify if everything is working correctly. And then that's how this entire implementation works. The other way you can work is using single agent. For example, I wanted to do just create spec over here. I could go ahead and kind of choose a specific spec writer or a PR shepherd. So in this case, I could say, hey, I just want the spec specialist to work on this so that the spec is created. And let's say the end part of spec specialist is where it directly goes and adds this to my Jira ticket or adds it back into my repository where I store my specs. So over here, I'll just go ahead and kind of ask it to use the orchestration mode. And when I do that, what it will do is it will assign my first agent, which is the coordinator. Think of this coordinator more like a PM. So what coordinator is doing is it's basically kind of going to look at this issue, start writing the spec for it, ask me questions whenever it feels like there are pieces that it hasn't completely understood. And once that is done, it provides me the entire spec that has been created, and I can then start kind of editing the spec line at the same point. So in this case, the coordinator can also then go ahead and start adding more agents. So at this point of time, I have a single agent working, but the coordinator can, once the spec is created, decide how many more implementers are required or verifiers are required to kind of actually do this change. So while it's creating the spec, let's quickly go back and talk about some of the integrations. So I said, typically you'd use Augment Augie, but if you want, there are other options for you to use different platforms. But in this case, the most important one is, how did I get my linear ticket kind of associated? I just use my linear connection over here. And I can go ahead and add other MCPs as well, because there might be places where you might want to add other MCPs. So over here, this is where you can go ahead and add all the different MCPs that you want to use. In my case, I have Context 7, sequential thinking, Notion, and MongoDB also assigned to this intent instance. Someone talked about Caveman. So right now, we don't exactly have a Caveman optimization working, but we already have RTK optimization working, which also gives a good amount of reduction in token usage. So at this point of time, feel free to use RTK optimization. I've seen, in general, it provides the same accuracy, but at a lower token cost. In terms of specialists and the agents, I talked about coordinator, but I did want to talk about how flexible this entire system is. So when you look at any of these specialists, it's in the end a combination of the model system prompt, right? So I can choose which model do I want to provide. So for a coordinator, I might want to go ahead and use something like Opus 4.7 because there's a lot of thinking that is involved. But if you look at the system prompt, this is something that comes pre-built, so you don't have to necessarily change it if you don't want to. But here's where the system prompt talks about what are the hard rules. For example, the coordinator is never supposed to touch the code, never edit the code, right? And things like that. And how does it work? It will basically create a subset of multiple tasks, and each task are then assigned to waves. For example, everything that needs all the tasks associated with backend should be, let's say, wave 1. Once they are implemented, that's when we can start working on, let's say, the API layer or the front-end layer, right? So it will automatically create all the tasks which are required and then group those tasks into multiple waves. And every of this wave needs to have verification cycles happening. So you can't go to wave 2 without having a complete end-to-end verification happening for wave 1. And then if you look at workflow, it talks about, first of all, go ahead and rename this space, go ahead and do a little bit of research. And then once that is done, go ahead and kind of create the spec for me. Once the spec is created, go ahead and ask for approval. Do not proceed until user approves the spec. then go on and kind of go through all the process and go through the implementation verification cycles, see if multiple iterations are needed for that. But once the verifier says everything is good to go, is when you are going to go ahead and kind of say, yes, things are done. And then you can actually go ahead and change what kind of format you get for specs, what kind of formats you get for each of those task blocks which get created. So you can go ahead and create your own particular agent specialist if you want. For example, I've created one for research and another one for spec creation. For example, I wanted particular policy pillars to be taken into account when I'm creating like a epic spec or a high level spec. So you can go ahead and create your own kind of implementations of those. But going back to my example, over here, it's gone ahead and kind of said, hey, I mean, the spec has been created. So let's look at the spec, right? So here's the spec which was created. And what you see is you can actually start utilizing the same ADE for not only your agentic environment, but also looking at what has been created by the agents. You can go ahead and add a new browser to kind of test out some things, or a new terminal to test out whether the test cases which are created are actually working, or just create new task nodes for yourself. So everything can happen through intent itself. You can just go ahead and kind of start looking into what was created. So in this case, I actually opened a specific task list, but let's look at the spec. It went ahead and talked about what are the goals that need to be kind of created, what's the linear ticket associated, and what are some of the subtasks which need to be created, right? So I can go ahead, and this is where I would start looking at a specific spec, and then go back and start iterating on, hey, I mean, there are things that I want to kind of change, or there are things that I want to kind of work on based on. So let's say I want to add an integration test that looks at eviction path end to end. This is what I want to kind of add to my given spec. And remember that I could also go ahead and start doing those changes over here. So if I wanted a specific non-goal to be added over here, I could just go ahead and add a specific non-goal that needs to be added to my spec. So all of this is where you're actually pair programming with the agent. It's not that the agent is only creating everything and you can't change it on the go. It's basically you and agent working together. So I think a quick break. I think I saw a couple of questions. I can't see the screen. Can you just repeat the questions?
Yeah, give me a second.
Sure.
I don't see questions for intent itself.
Okay.
It talks about the coordinator agent being non-deterministic, would be relying on something like that. Could be unreliable by nature. Ideally, we'd have an enterprise platform that works like a state machine based off of the state machine gates that they launch other agents and tasks.
Right. So that's a great question. So the question I think is, hey, I mean, the coordinator agent is still an agent, and sure, it may work 90% of the times, but how do we ensure that it works 100% of the times, and that 10% is somehow taken into account for? So there are two ways I would kind of think about that question. So first of all, I mean, you're absolutely right. Coordinator is still an agent, right? And hence is not deterministic in nature. But each of these agents can be kind of controlled through a deterministic behavior by using things like hooks or particular scripts, which ideally kind of are parts of that deterministic behavior you want to incorporate. For example, within, let's say, a verification cycle, I could add the specific ways in which I want these verifications to happen, and what are some of the kind of workflow patterns that need to be followed before I can say, yes, this particular test cycle is considered to be approved. So while the agent in itself can be non-deterministic, but this orchestration of the agents can effectively kind of catch hold of things that can be missed by a single agentic traversal. So by default, when you think about this entire cycle, I would say think about it more like a workflow, where you're kind of taking into account that these agents are going to be non-deterministic.
And then how does it look in a greenfield versus brownfield? Like, is this reserved solely for greenfield, or are there opportunities elsewhere?
On the contrary, I mean, if you think about it, Kubernetes example, I mean, Kubernetes is one of the biggest open source repositories out there. So this is a pure brownfield kind of involvement. But ideally, I mean, when you're looking at a brownfield aspect in terms of, taking care of things which are already pre-created, this is where kind of Augment comes into play. So even when I'm kind of looking at creation of the specs, maybe in this example, we don't have, over here, if you look at one of the acceptance criteria, it's already looked at what is already created within the Kubernetes code repository, and effectively how does that kind of apply to the spec that I'm creating, right? So unless Augment had an understanding of what threshold maps is and what container ephemeral storage limit eviction as a rule is, I wouldn't be able to kind of create this as a part of this spec. So that's kind of where combination of Augment's context engine with your spec-driven development kind of covers that gap between is this going to be something that you only use for Greenfield, or is this something that you can use from day one on Brownfield applications? So any other questions?
There's a question around whether or not we're aware, anybody on the call is aware of a team member at WEX who's tried or is currently trying spec-driven development with a Brownfield DBT project, which works with Snowflake.
I mean, I think that would be a question for someone from the WEX team.
Yeah, we'll take that one away. We'll answer that one after the call. I'm not familiar with anybody top of my head that's doing deep-driven specs yet.
Yeah, we'll keep our ears and eyes out as conversations continue as well. So thanks for that question.
So I just wanted to show the workflow because obviously, I mean, it's going to take me a lot more time for covering the Kubernetes example, but I just wanted to show you how the entire workflow works. So coordinator went ahead, created the spec, and once the specs are created, it created multiple tasks. So in this case, I mean, in my topology, the spec was created with, I think around, let's say 6 different tasks, right? So so you see that each of these tasks in itself is a mini spec where I'm having task nodes where the objectives, scope, environmental context, inputs, what's definition of done, and what verification needs to happen has been created for every task. So when the spec was created, there were 6 tasks created, but if you see, I mean, task 1 and 2 are more about the MongoDB model and the backend API endpoint. So if you really think about it, they have to be wave 1 or the first wave that gets done. Then the next thing would be more of the actual list components and the front-end components that need to be created. And lastly, it is about, actually adding it to your profile pages and admin users tab. So what the coordinator effectively did was over here, it went ahead, created those different aspects around, what are different agents need to be created. And then went ahead and assigned wave 1 to these 2 implementers. Now, once this was sent for verification, the verifier came back and said, hey, I mean, the second implementer did not actually implement it correctly. So the second implementer was called again to actually kind of go ahead and kind of do the changes that are needed to make the verifier kind of accept all the changes. And once this was done, we went to wave 2, and the same thing kind of happens in wave 2 and wave 3. So effectively, if you look at it, the coordinator automatically starts taking care of, or is your PM agent in this case now, which is now starting to take control of, how is this task going to be broken down and how it is going to be implemented in phases. And then last but not the least, I mean, just like you would expect from your typical IDs, I mean, you can always go back and kind of look at any specific changes being done. What does your repo structure look like? And then what was specifically created in terms of your spec and task nodes. So that's kind of a brief background on intent. And the reason we wanted to just show it as a demo right now is because I think a lot of focus is right now in terms of standardizing and creation of those specs that need to be created and utilizing some of the different tools out there. But I just want to kind of just cover what intent is. What I was thinking from our perspective is if the team members are interested and they want to kind of download and use intent, then what we can do is we can have a subsequent second version of this enablement where I can do a workshop where anyone who's interested can actually kind of follow through or work with us on a particular example. And we can showcase how you can use intent for actual kind of PR creations using the tickets that you have. Or maybe I'll take an example of an open source repository like I showed you right now, and we can kind of go through that entire process.
Amazing. Thanks, Sharath. Thanks, Rob, and thanks for the participation from the WEX team. As Sharath mentioned, we had talked about a second opportunity for a workshop where we would bring more intent to your team to align with your spec-driven development goals. As a part of that, we have been granted complimentary credits for the WEX team to leverage intent. So don't get ahead of yourself. They're not available yet, but upon setting up that next meeting, we will have an environment for you all to, or credits for you all to leverage within the WEX environment. Intent is built on Augie CLI, so same security and everything would move through that. And the idea is, how could the team bring agent orchestration and leverage that spec-driven development? So thank you all for your time. I'll work with Christian and Vish for subsequent meetings, but really appreciate the participation. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out via email to our team. Anything else?
Thank you so much.
Great. Christian, Vish, anything else?
No, I really like the way you brought the spec-driven development with some pragmatic examples into X. It was very helpful in my view.
Yeah, and just some quick housekeeping for the WEX team. This will be recorded and available probably by the end of the day, however long Google Meet takes. If you want to continue the discussion, hop in the AI SDLC enabled chat. I dropped that link in the chat, and it's also in the meeting invite as well. And yeah, you know where to find us. Thank you so much for coming and having really great questions. And thank you so much to the Augment team. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye.
Thank you.